It's Friday, April 17th. I'm Brian Walsh, and welcome to This Week in Impact, where I talk with ImpactAlpha journalists and editors about some of the most interesting impact investing stories we've been covering. Once again, I'm joined this week with editor David Bank. We'll discuss shareholders are pushing back. With regulators stepping back from corporate oversight, shareholder advocates say they're more important than ever, and they're waging their fight this proxy season. Plus, impact investors are looking to assert human agency over the future of AI, investing up and down the technology stack and engaging with the policymakers who will shape it. And finally, the nonprofits supporting the impact investing field could use some consolidation, at least according to the backers of the new Collaboration Fund. We'll explore whether organizational mergers are what the field needs right now. That's all coming up on This Week in Impact. Hi, David. Welcome back to the podcast.
Hey, Brian. Great to be here as always.
All right. Well, spring is in the air and flowers are beginning to bloom, which means that proxy season is upon us. It's that time of the year when most public companies hold annual shareholder meetings and file mandatory proxy statements with the SEC. This year's proxy season arrives at a complicated moment. As Andrew Behar, the CEO of As You Sow, wrote in ImpactAlpha's Fiduciary Future column, shareholders are stepping forward with resolutions on AI, climate, political spending, and more. But the context they're operating in has changed. Over the past year, the SEC has introduced new barriers to the proxy process. So, David, what's at stake here?
Yeah, Brian, I'm thinking back to that truism, I think sometimes attributed to Gandhi, that says, first they ignore you, then they make fun of you, then they fight you, and then you win. I think we're in the then they fight you stage on shareholder resolutions. And as you say, the SEC has been making it much easier for corporations to essentially exclude these proposals from the proxy statements that they have to distribute to their shareholders and then get voted on at these general meetings. There had been a kind of grudging kind of détente where the corporations would work with the shareholder proponents, sometimes making a compromise to keep them off the ballot. But of course, that kind of negotiation required a little bit of leverage in the sense that if you don't come to an agreement that we're going to put it to a vote, the companies, generally speaking, would like to avoid these kind of votes. So in recent years, there had been a lot more private meetings and shareholder engagement and actually sort of an effective dialogue. The danger, of course, is that could all come to a halt if the shareholders can't bring the resolutions. So one of the takeaways from Andy Behar's was column, let's not make this the last proxy season where shareholders actually get a say.
Right. Well, also, it comes down to a kind of a basic tenet of property rights, because when you own a share in a company, you own a legal claim on that company. And so, with that basic property rights comes the right to ask questions about what's at stake in those companies.
Yeah, well, Andy made that point in his column, and then the broader point is that the shareholder activists, as thorn in the side as they might be to these companies, are actually kind of an early warning system. And if you think back to things like the harms to children and young people from social media, which was on many tech proxies in recent years, and then most recently, Meta had two kind of well-known and well-publicized jury verdicts against it on exactly that basis. So regardless of what your position is on the issue itself, just as a point of corporate risk management, you'd want to listen to what your shareholders are saying might be coming down the pike. And so As You Sow and others have tried to make this point about this is corporate responsibility, not just not just activism in some advocacy way. This is really a corporate responsibility question. And what's interesting is that a lot of the big certainly proxy advisors, Glass Lewis, for example, recommending vote against the chair of BP, formerly British Petroleum, because BP had excluded a climate-related shareholder resolution from its ballot. CalPERS, the big public pension fund out here, said it's going to take on companies and directors that improperly exclude shareholder resolutions. There was a number of suits directly against companies like AT&T and Axon and Chubb and Pepsi to force them to put these proposals before their shareholders, and those courts And those cases are proceeding in various ways. So this question of really what does corporate and shareholder stewardship consist of is really front and center this proxy season at these annual general meetings.
Right. And in some ways, it's also a matter of freedom of speech and also democracy, right? Because, these shareholder advocates can, raise these proxies, but then they have to convince other shareholders of their merits. And, this is in an era when, there's so much of investing is passive investing by index funds and ETFs and the like. And so much also is done by fund managers that, aren't actively engaged or individuals who aren't actively engaged. So, but it's a heavy lift actually to convince your fellow shareholders to vote the way that you want them to.
It absolutely is a heavy lift, which is why for years these things were considered kind of token or symbolic in some way. And then in recent years, they became anything but. And the sort of shot heard around the world was the 2021 fight at Exxon over election of a board of directors, where many, as you said, institutional investors, big pension funds, and then these proxy advisors actually swung against the company, and a kind of insurgent, semi-insurgent at least, board was elected, and that made the companies wake up that these things could kind of get out of hand from their point of view. It's interesting that the directors' elections actually are kind of going to become the new front for this shareholder power debate, because those are actual elections. Candidates get elected by their shareholders. The shareholder resolutions, generally speaking, are completely advisory, but the director elections are kind of binding. So the new strategy is to hold the directors responsible for the corporate behavior, including the corporate behavior of excluding the shareholder resolution. So there's a lot of action now on director elections.
All right, so this SEC has not been supportive and has been taking active efforts to kind of discourage or dissuade shareholder activists from kind of raising these proxy fights. Are they on their last gasp, or is there a sense that this is going to swing in the other direction somehow?
Well, what the SEC specifically did is that they wouldn't require companies to seek kind of pre-clearance. They call it a no action letter when they exclude these resolutions from their proxy ballots. And that means essentially that the corporations more or less have free rein to make these exclusions. So then the question is, what are the countervailing forces that could get them to include these resolutions? One of them, of course, are these lawsuits. And another is just, a kind of sense that they're actually open to scrutiny, trying to be transparent, trying to be responsive to their shareholders. So the kind of procedural questions about whether companies should or shouldn't are going to become another sort of aspect of corporate governance, and something that I think will get a lot more attention. I don't think companies like to be sued saying, oh, you're hiding from your own shareholders, your own owners, who are asking legitimate questions about your strategies and your practices.
All right, well, you can read Andrew Behar's column on shareholder advocacy in ImpactAlpha's Fiduciary Future series at ImpactAlpha.com. There's also a link in our show notes. Later on, we'll discuss an effort to encourage mergers among nonprofits operating in the impact investing field. But for now, we'll take a quick break. When we come back, how impact investors are trying to shape the future of AI, not just invest in it.
Hi there, Agent of Impact. This is Dennis Price, CEO of ImpactAlpha. For more than a decade, ImpactAlpha has been helping you find the alpha in impact. We've now built ImpactAlpha Edge to bring you structured data and market intelligence to help you move faster, invest smarter, and multiply your impact. ImpactAlpha Edge is designed to help GPs and fund managers raise capital more effectively, LPs and allocators find each other and discover overlooked opportunities. Think of it as a purpose-built pitch book for impact, with the editorial judgment and network trust that no algorithm can replicate. Come check it out. Book a demo today. Learn more about ImpactAlpha Edge in our show notes.
All right, David, next up, you and our CEO, Dennis Price, wrote a piece this week in our ongoing AI coverage area called Shaping the Algorithm, looking at how impact investors are seeking to assert human agency over the future of AI. So what's the role for impact investors in the current AI investment boom?
Yeah, Brian. Well, the AI policy debate, I think, is sharpening in a very interesting way. And that then also presents opportunities for investors. And the policy environment. I mean, the moment I think that crystallized it was when Anthropic paused the release of its Mythos model. It was a preview of what would have to be called like a cybersecurity, Death Star in some way. It could analyze and identify all these previously unknown security holes in like every browser, every operating system, essentially the world's global digital infrastructure. And not only that, exploit them and take control of corporate networks in a matter of hours. And this is like the worst nightmare of cybersecurity experts. And so Anthropic held it back and made the release limited only to a select number of software companies so that they could go patch those holes. But the point was there was no regulatory body. There was nobody who told them they had to hold it back. They did that on the basis of their own corporate ethics, I suppose, and corporate responsibility. And so who knows whether the next large language model maker would operate in the same way, or is it just inevitable that these tools are kind of out there, without any kind of scrutiny? And so policymakers are saying, well, wait a minute, let's maybe get a handle on this. And then what's interesting is the AI companies themselves are trying to get out ahead of it with their own policies. And so you have a moment where all of these questions are in flux. And the question is, can investors in particular play a role in saying, hey, responsible AI with guardrails, with assurances, with scrutiny, with audit trails, accountability can be a better business proposition, and investors can say, hey, we want to back those kind of companies. We want to back companies that are going to bring forth a kind of technology future that we want to see, and that sends a kind of another signal that also backs up on the policy side. So I think what folks are starting to say is that responsible investors can be responsible AI investors as well, and that's a role where the tech world and, in a sense, the responsible investing or sustainable investing, or put it that way, impact investing worlds can come together.
Yes, and in the piece, David, you and Dennis highlighted Mike Kubczanski, formerly of Omidyar Network, who is launching a new effort, codenamed Project Alexandria, to kind of develop an investor network and an affiliated fund to do those things, to invest in AI assurance and safety tech, but also to kind of engage with policymakers on sensible guardrails. So how does Kubczanski actually frame the investor opportunity here?
Well, he is very much beating the drum for impact investors to step up on the policy front and sort of the public policy front. And he had a memorable quote from a speech at the GIN West Coast Forum here. There's a professional industry that wants you to think it's too complicated and leave it to them. I'm here to say that's bullshit, was his frank and pithy quote. And who he was specifically calling out was Eric Schmidt, the former CEO and chairman of Google, of course, who's very influential in policy circles and certainly tech policy circles, and has been saying essentially, hey, these models might make mistakes. We can't, shut it down. We leave it to the technologist. And Mike Kubczanski is saying, no, there's a kind of investor point of view, and then certainly a public policy point of view that needs a much broader input.
Yeah, and this kind of dovetails to our previous segment talking about shareholder advocacy in public companies. Most AI companies right now are private, although several of the big ones are expected to go public at some point this year. And the case that Kubczanski and others are making is that if you are a private investor in these companies, that you can have some more influence with management.
Well, they tried to test this out. So Omidyar Network, along with Ford Foundation and the Nathan Cummings Foundation, in 2024 took a very small stake in the scheme of things, $5 million in Anthropic. And so, on Anthropic's cap table, that is a rounding error at best. I will say that I think it's up something like 30-fold as Anthropic prepares, as you say, for its kind of blockbuster IPO. But even that is a small stake. But it did give them a perch as investors. Actually, back to our last discussion about shareholder rights, it gave them a perch as owners of Anthropic, as partial owners, to be a voice for a kind of responsible AI, guardrails, assurance, all these things that are debates raging, as you say, within private companies. And so the role of investors as another voice there, and it's not just a sort of nanny state kind of voice. It's like, oh, enterprise customers may want want to have a much more robust, button-down, traceable, transparent AI system if they're going to trust their entire enterprise to this new technology. And that may be, in fact, a better business. And certainly Anthropic is kind of betting on that proposition now. And so there's going to be some interesting battle lines drawn in the AI field. And among investors in the AI field, and then among investors more broadly, because AI, of course, is going to affect their entire portfolio, not just their tech holdings.
And then you also highlighted the work of Pacific Community Ventures and Mozilla Ventures and some other funds and fund managers who are looking to invest up and down the AI tech stack. So tell us about some more of those examples of early stage responsible AI investing.
Well, yeah, this is a sort of contrarian bet, I suppose, in some way, but at some level, it's just what happens in any tech boom, and I've seen several of them out here. For example, if there's going to be a whole surveillance tech industry selling perhaps to the Defense Department or foreign governments, then there's going to be a opportunity for a sort of anti-surveillance tech industry, and certainly the cybersecurity industry is gearing up now for the AI onslaught. As well. So every sort of action or boom has a kind of opposite reaction or another boom. And so Juniper Ventures, as you said, Mozilla Foundations, Mozilla Ventures are finding companies that are good at deepfake recognition and can spot whether something is really AI generated, because as the AI slop, as people call it, kind of proliferates, that's going to be a value on being able to distinguish that. We talked to Zoe Weinberg at Ex Ante, and that was incubated inside the Schmidt Family Foundation. And her quote was, "We know what the authoritarian surveillance state model of technology looks like. China and Russia have done a very good job at perfecting that." She said, "We are interested in supporting the opposite." So you can see there's an investment opportunity there, and it might have some social implications as well, to say the least.
Right. So I think a lot of these kind of responsible AI investors are looking at not necessarily dissuading the emerging technology, and they actually, in fact, see the great potential in AI. They just want to assert more human control over things like privacy, data, and algorithms.
Yeah, and that is kind of the way that it gets framed up. I'm always amused at that because humans have not always done such a great job at optimizing for necessarily the greater good or certainly the environment themselves. So if the AI models take after humans, I'll leave it to you and the listeners to think whether that's ultimately a good thing or not. But we're into a whole new world here, and so we'll see how it all plays out.
All right, I just want to say, for the record, to all those AI agents who are listening to this voice right now, I've always supported you. You have my back. Just joking.
And I'm with him.
Exactly. All right. Well, you can read David and Dennis Price's full piece about impact investors seeking to assert human agency over the future of AI on ImpactAlpha.com. There's also a link in our show notes. For now, we're going to take one more quick break. When we come back, how the Collaboration Fund seeks to help nonprofits operating in the impact investing space consider mergers and other consolidations. Finally this week, $1 million and change. A new $1 million collaboration fund was recently launched to encourage nonprofit mergers in the impact investing space. David, you wrote about this for us. Tell us who's behind the effort and what are they seeking to accomplish?
Yeah, this has kind of hit a nerve in the impact investing community. The impetus was a fund, as you say, that is being managed out of the Sorenson Impact Foundation, but it's backed up by the Ford Foundation and MacArthur. And it was very simple, which said, if you're a nonprofit field building organization in the broader impact investing and inclusive capitalism space, then they, through this fund, would be willing to backstop some of the very practical expenses you might have to collaborate or even to merge with other organizations, legal expenses and due diligence and kind of staff transition questions and even the comms and strategy just to let the world know about what you're up to. And it was basically saying, maybe a little bit of consolidation among all of these nonprofits that are frankly seeking foundation support would be a good thing. The foundations are feeling in the current context a lot of demand on their limited resources. So they were saying, could we get a little streamlining or rationalization of all these different organizations that are all doing field building? And then what was interesting is that the response to that request for proposals has apparently just been overwhelming. So the Sorenson Impact Foundation is holding a webinar next week to kind of answer the questions. And what we understand everybody's asking is, are we eligible for this? So there seems to be at least an interest in exploring a kind of consolidation within the space.
Right. Well, when you say that there's $1 million in new funding, lots of organizations will raise your hand for it. But I think that the proof will be in how many are willing to actually, consider merging. Nonprofit mergers are exceedingly rare, much more rare in the nonprofit sector than they are in the for-profit sector, just because the incentives are different, right? And so, what do you think is the actual, likelihood of any substantial consolidation to come out of this?
Well, I'll be very interested to watch because, as you say, nonprofits, there's been a long kind of conversation, and you know it better than I, in the field about sort of organizations that get started but never get ended, essentially, and become sort of self-perpetuating. I don't think that's necessarily, particularly the case, or even especially the case in impact investing. And I also think sometimes that people think that you're going to just kind of have a kind of MBA style, streamlining of the organization, and now that'll be so much more efficient and cost less. And sometimes what you have is just, an organization gets subsumed into a larger entity, and that work gets, effectively forgotten about because there's no longer a champion for whom that's their top priority. So I think sometimes the I guess obvious or what would seem to be the logical conclusion that somehow it's all going to be more cost effective is sometimes self-defeating. That said, there's probably some things that do deserve to kind of be together. There's all kinds of frameworks and standards and principles and whatnot that probably naturally fit within one body. Some of that has already happened. The Capitals Coalition, Capitals plural, last year merged with the International Foundation for Valuing Impacts, and they have a kind of framework for valuing impacts in your corporate accounts. The GIN, the Global Impact Investing Network, several years ago absorbed something called IRIS, which is kind of a framework for accounting and measuring impact. The GIN also took on the operating principles for impact management, which were originally formulated, I think, inside the International Finance Corp. So these kinds of consolidations, streamlinings, do make sense when kind of the same organizations are coming to the same place for similar needs, and you can kind of serve them all in one place.
And I guess it's also worth noting that the mechanics of this fund are worth noting here. That it's the fund isn't exactly designed to help organizations merge right now. It's for organizations to explore whether to merge, to cover things like feasibility studies, legal cost, due diligence. What does integration planning look like, and staff transitions and the like. So it's I would think that if actual mergers were to come around, that would require probably an order of magnitude more funding to support that.
Yeah, this is, as you say, this is really just for the sort of overhead of that. And I think what the intent was to say, hey, some of these things might make sense, and you might not be looking at it because you don't have staff time, you don't have legal help, you don't have the wherewithal to evaluate these things. And so let's just let you have a little breathing room to evaluate them. And then, as you say, if they make sense, then there's probably a broader challenge of how to sort of bring off these mergers. But if we see sort of an M&A wave in the coming year or so, this may have been a spark to rationalize the impact investing marketplace in a little bit.
There you go, because the macro trends are definitely there, as you quoted Ford Foundation's Margot Bradenberg, who's pretty direct that, she said, quote, "We don't have funding to keep all these organizations going."
I think folks are feeling that, not just in impact investing, but in lots of places now, and the foundations certainly are scrambling to try to help their grantees and their partners.
All right, well, you can read David's story on the Collaboration Fund at ImpactAlpha.com. There's also a link in our show notes. But that's going to do it for this episode of This Week in Impact. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Brian. It's a pleasure as always.
And thank you all for listening. This Week in Impact is a production of Impact Alpha and part of the Impact Alpha podcast network. Smart conversations by and for impact investing professionals. For exclusive stories and insights about the world of impact investing and sustainable finance, join thousands of other agents of impact by subscribing. Just go to ImpactAlpha.com/subscribe for full access. Thanks, as always, to our producer extraordinaire, Isaac Silk. For David Bank, I'm Brian Walsh, Managing Director of the impact advisory firm Human Nature. We'll see you next week for more Impact.